Thank you. All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to session number 2 of the RAINcap Bootcamp. I want to open this session by apologizing for the issues that we had.
Ani, yes? Can I just check? Some people are still connecting.
Yeah, but it's okay. We can start. All right. So we are here today for session number 2 of the RAINcap Bootcamp on how much you should raise. And I wanted to open this up. I sent you guys an email this morning, but I wanted to apologize for the issues we had yesterday, in which we had some limited capacity. As you can see, it has now been resolved. And we hope that from now on you have a pleasant experience with us, and we are offering 3 different ways that you guys can fulfill your attendance, and that is either connecting to the live session, going to any of the watch parties, or watching the recording and submitting that form that we created so that we can give you credit for your attendance. I'm gonna begin sharing my screen here in a bit. And remember, please, if you have any questions, make use of the chat feature, and this way we are able to keep order in the room, but also have a track record of all of those questions that you have so that we can answer them in the future. All right, so here we are on session number 2 about how much you should raise, and looks like we uploaded. So please remember that the main sessions are being recorded. The breakout activities are not. Those are meant to be a moment for you guys to connect in a smaller group and apply the content of today's session. Today's class agenda, I am giving you the welcome. We have a guest speaker, Steve Burke from the SBDC. He's going to be teaching us how to get the UEI number. This is extremely important because when you apply for the grant, this is a requirement, and we're going to have this training so that those of you that do not have it are able to get it. It doesn't take a lot of time, but it is important that you get started on it so that you don't have this as a roadblock for your application when that time comes. And then we have our guest speaker, Peter Thurston, who's going to talk about how much you should raise. We'll go into the breakout session, and then we are going to have a Q&A and session close. Please remember to remain muted, use the chat, be nice with each other, do not market your services. This is an educational program, and that is the main focus of this. With that, I just want to share our program once again. Today, we're going to be talking about how much you should raise. And next week, we're going to be talking about making financial strategic decisions for growth so that you can establish some priorities on how to invest the money in your business. And with that, I want to remind you that the makeup session for the ones that couldn't connect yesterday is going to be on Monday, the 13th at 6 p.m. I already sent you guys a calendar invite so that you are able to connect. And there's also an email that goes out about 15 minutes earlier so that you have that information there and a reminder. So why you need to get a certificate and get a grant application? You need to attend 3 out of the 4 sessions or watch the recording and submit that form, or go to one of the watch parties that our project coordinators are hosting in each of your areas. And then we have 2 takeaway forms. One is for this week, the other one is for next week. So these takeaway forms are very simple, and they are bundled together for the 2 sessions that we see each week. And I will be sending an email tomorrow so that you can have this link. It is also embedded on the slides that you already have. And with that, I want to hand it over to Sharon.
Thanks, Ani. Well, I get to introduce our guest speaker, which I'm thrilled to do. I've known Steve Burke for, it's been over 10 years, Steve. Do you realize that? We worked together. I used to work with the SBDC also. And so I worked there for 5.5 years. So it was 5.5 years directly working with Steve. And then in my job as executive director of the Economic Development Council, I stayed engaged with him. And then now we have an SBDC advisor. And for those of you that don't know, SBDC stands for the Small Business Development Center. And Steve is from the Washington State Small Business Development Center. He is the manager of Western Washington. Is that correct? Or is that changed? Still the same? Okay. And so Steve is a man of knowledge. He absorbs knowledge. He knows how to share that knowledge in ways that people can understand. And he's always the first one to step up to learn something that is really important for businesses to know. As we know, through COVID, a lot of new things happened. Like, he was right on the front line, leading the pack of, okay, we got to get this information together. We have to absorb it. It's ever changing. Let's get it pinned down. And he was just so forceful and effective in getting that information out. So I'm just thrilled that he agreed to come here and share this information. So with that, Steve, take it away.
Well, thank you, Sharon. You know, you're right. We've spent a lot of time during the pandemic sharing the latest and helping people through it. By the way, hi, Krista. It's good to see that you're here today. I've had many clients that we've worked with through the pandemic period. But I'm going to share my screen and get right on with the presentation. I want to make sure that I'm not the one that's holding up your time today. I know that you've got a lot going on, so I know that I'm. All right, so today I'm going to cover with you this thing called the unique identity, federal unique identity identification number. Going to cover what it is needed for, and how to get it. And I'm going to be, fairly straight with you on these things. The reality is that there's a reason why this came about. Many of you might know or remember that there was a real, when the pandemic happened, it was essentially overnight. I remember being sent home from my office on March 23rd of 2020. And
keep looking.
And
You're moving too fast.
Excuse me, everyone, please make sure that you are muted so that we do not interrupt the process. Thank you.
Thanks. So what happened is that in the mad dash to get money out to people, there was those who took advantage of the circumstances. And this happened in the Paycheck Protection Program known as a PPP, as well as the Target Idle Assistance, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant, the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, and all of these programs that we spent so much time with in 2020, 2021, and the beginning of last year. So much fraud. So that at some point around the second quarter of last year, Congress forced the SBA and the federal government to identify who money was going to. And that's what's the real cause behind this unique entity ID. For any of you who are wondering, participating in this program means that you are minimizing the chance. I'm sure we're never going to eliminate it, but minimize the chance that there could be fraudulent use of federal funds. So with that, the first place that you have to start is at sam.gov. Sam.gov has been around for a long time. It is the primary portal that anybody who wants to do work with the federal government contracting. So if you want to become a contractor to the federal government, which by the way is the largest supplier coordinator of opportunities in the U.S. Actually, I think it's around the world. So any of you who want to build your businesses and expand into trying to get connected as a only federal government supplier, sam.gov is your source for that. But because sam.gov existed already, they decided to utilize the same platform to be able to get this unique entity ID so that they can be sure and identify where federal funds are going. And my understanding is that this program that all of you are in, I don't know if you know this, but my understanding is that it's being funded through a grant from the Washington State Department of Commerce that is utilizing federal funds. Many funds that have been sent to the states last year and are now being utilized through this grant process, which is enabling all of you to participate in this. So the unique entity ID is a 12-character alphanumeric value. It's assigned, managed, and owned by the federal government. It validates your organization's legal business name and address. The basic information that's required to get a unique entity ID, utilizing, starting with the login to sam.gov, is your legal business name, your physical address. Very important, it has to be a zip +4 and a sam.gov account. Well, how do you get a sam.gov account? Basically, you go to sam.gov. It's really that straightforward. So you've got to go there first, and then you're going to establish an account or a basic login to sam.gov. And so when you get there, you are going to start with what's known as the entity registration. And this is whether or not you're going to be a new contractor with the government, federal government, or whether or not you're just trying to register for the UEI for other things, which is similar to what all of you are interested in, because this applies to federal funds that are even that are not involved in government contracting. If you want to work with Washington State Department of Commerce in a grant program like the one that you're doing that's utilizing federal funds, you'll need to have the UEI. If you are wanting to apply for an SBA loan through the Small Business Administration, you will need a UEI. So it's going to now be required for all federal programs that involve federal funds. And to do it, besides the information that I just showed you, you're going to need some assertions, representations, and certifications, and a little bit of other business information, which we'll cover right now. So going to sam.gov, the first thing that you get is how do we start establish an account in sam.gov? And you will click on this green button right here that says accept to be able to get your start, your basic account started with sam.gov. And of course, this is like many other things that you might sign up for today. You need an email address, a password, and then you're going to create an account, unless by chance you're somebody who already has one. But if you don't, you're going to then create your account. When you do, and you've been logged in, right? And there's usually a couple steps and maybe the CAPTCHA thing that you have to do, but we're pretty used to most of that, at least many of us are, in terms of getting a new account. And keep in mind, this is a federal government account. So to be able to utilize the kind of funds that you're pursuing, you then need to have, you'll get to this first screen, which is the very first thing that comes up, called entity management. And so you are going to go through, and the first thing you're going to do is click on this Get Started button right here when you first log into sam.gov, because any new account in sam.gov is going to get this screen in the first place, even if you're going to be a government contractor. This is where the difference separates government contractors from those who just need a UEI. If you are going to apply to be a government contractor, then you are going to actually register your entity by clicking on this green button. If, however, you're somebody who needs a UEI just for the purpose of supporting your ability to apply for some grants that ultimately are funded through the federal government, then or get an SBA loan or get into another federal program that involves federal funds, you will just need to get this unique entity ID, and you'll click on this lighter green button down on below of this screen, which you will see when you go through this process at sam.gov. So when you click on the lower green one, which is what most of you today would do, you're going to get to the enter your entity information. And I've got to say, this is really super important. You've got to have your correct legal business name. You've got to identify the country, your street address, the zip code +4, your city and your state. I didn't show it, but down here in the bottom right-hand side of this particular field screen is the next button that allows you to move forward through the process. And so when you've entered all this information, it has to be as accurate and as close to what is available on common databases. For instance, if you can find your address on Google, then that's one of those things that would establish you and your actual location. So what happens next, and this is usually where the difficulty comes for anybody who is trying to get the UEI and struggles with it. The key here is being able to validate your entity information. They're going to show you here what you entered, and then they're going to show you the following matches that they came up with. And they're going to want you to pick the most correct one. The key here is for those that, in fact, don't have a match. I don't show it, but down in the bottom right-hand side of this screen, you will see a button to resolve your actual address. Hopefully you've entered correctly your correct physical address and filled out the things correctly so that there is a match in the commonly held databases that the federal government is using for this purpose. If you don't, once again, you will have to go to a entity validation resolution button, which is actually down on the bottom right-hand side of this screen. And you get to click on that. It's a red button, and you'll go through a separate process to try and do the validated entity. And then once you do, you come up with that, they're going to say that you then have a validated an entity. So they know that your actual information is correct and that they've been able to identify that and that they're validating because they really do want to know where federal funds are going to minimize the fraud, the extensive fraud in billions of dollars that happened during the pandemic. So you then get to decide, and it's up to you whether or not you want to be included in a public search or not. You can choose not to do that, or you can choose to do that if you want. But the most important part here is that as the business owner who's involved in this, you have to be the one who certifies that you are authorized to conduct the transactions on behalf of the entity. Very, very important. So you, before requesting it, you've got to certify under penalty of law that you are authorized to conduct transactions for this entity to reduce the likelihood of unauthorized, i.e. fraudulent transactions. Once you've done that and you go to the next, they will actually give you your UEI number, which is a grayed out here as I went through this. You would actually get this UEI number. You want to make sure that you record that number from this screen. Take a screenshot, write it down. You will be using this if you're going to apply for this grant or any other grants involving federal loans. So the verified SAM record, which is located here from in the sam.gov, and then you click on the done button. That's really as difficult as this is. Once again, the only thing that's difficult is if they cannot validate the address that you entered and have a validated entry. With that, I'm going to go just to the last screen, talk a little bit about people were asking what the SBDC is. The SBDC was actually created in 1980 by Congress in the original Small Business Act. We exist in all states, and certainly our partners in Oregon, where Robert was from. And in most of the territories, there's actually 62 total networks. Here in Washington, we are the Washington State Network of the SBDC. We've got 28 locations around the state. We've got the largest technical assistance footprint with 28 advisors ready to help you. If you are interested at some point and want to get in touch with us, the fastest way to get to an advisor near you is by sending an email to washington@wsbdc.org or 833-492-7232. And I will be sending the slide deck so that you can all have that, and Funny, you can pass that around. And with that, before I wrap up, Sharon, were there any questions that somebody had that I could potentially answer?
Thank you so much, Steve. We had a few questions. It was mostly about what the different numbers are, but I already sent that on the chat so that they had clarification. I also shared Christina's contact information. She is the SBDC advisor hosted in EDC, and she kindly offered that if you guys needed any kind of help running into issues with acquiring your UEI, that she is available for that. So thank you so much for sharing this with us. We really appreciate it. And I hope that you guys get started on that. Get started as soon as possible, because like he mentions, this is something that you need in order to be able to apply for the grant. It is part of the application. We are going to ask you what your UEI number is. So whether you are thinking about it or not, just do make sure that if you are going to apply, you need to have that in order. And any kind of grants that require any federal funding is going to ask you for it, as Steve mentioned. So do make sure that you do that. I will send an email as well with some links that can be helpful for this process, and I will also include a few of them in different languages that Sharon kindly looked up and shared with us. So with that, I am
And
going
if by
to...
chance you still struggle with it, reach out to us. Don't try and struggle with it alone. Doesn't make
Yes,
sense to do that.
That is correct. And the SBDC is free for all of you guys. So do know that that service is available to you, and they can help you with a lot of things. Actually, you can get one-on-one support through them. And I am also a former SBDC advisor, and it is a really good organization. So you guys know that you now have that resource available to you. So let's move on to our main topic for the day. And that is how much you should raise. I have the pleasure of introducing to you to Peter Thorson. Peter has been an amazing partner for us on different programs. He works at Palo Alto Software. I don't know if some of you are familiarized with the Life Plan program. This is something that you can use to develop your business plan, to develop your financial projections, to see different scenarios so that you can dream about what you can achieve, then come back to reality, see what you can do, and then create a plan to be able to make those big dreams happen. So we're very glad to have him here and sharing all of the knowledge that he has with us. So with that, Peter, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, while I press the share screen button, yeah, thanks for that. Very nice. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like Ani said, I work at Live Plan, but everything we're going to talk about today, even though you can do it in that app, can also just be done on your own elsewhere, a quick spreadsheet, or just in your imagination. So don't feel like you need to learn something new just to get through today. And I think I'm going to try and, let's try and be like a little motivational here. I think the phrase "how much you should raise" can feel intimidating, or like, if you're like my first startup, the phrase "how much should I raise," it felt like something that someone else does. That's for other people. And I just want to emphasize, like, the way that we want to approach this today is something that I think is accessible and available to everyone here. And if that's not true, drop into chat why I'm wrong. Let's challenge that assumption, because our goal really is just to talk about this idea of how much funding might you ever need? What happens in the future? What can you imagine happening in the future that could be something that would be like either prompt or create a financing event, something where you might need to borrow some money for whatever reason? And if we understand the broad spectrum, and this is why this dovetails so well with Robert's talk, and if you missed that one, I'm not going to make it so you have to see one then the other. Don't worry. You can see this one, then that one. But I want it to become something where you're actively declining the other options that you're not pursuing, so that you're empowered and so that you're on top of what your options could be. That's my goal with today's talk: intelligently declining things that you're not pursuing and feeling like you have the capacity to potentially go in that direction. So, spoiler, I don't know if I'm supposed to do this, Ani, but the breakout session that we're going to do, I'll just let you all know in advance so you can follow along. The breakout session that you're going to do after I'm talking at you for 20s of minutes here is to imagine a scenario in your future that might spark your need for additional financing, something that you can't sell additional products to earn yourself. Now that might be something kind of mundane, like just, a little bit of a dip in sales and, oh, we need to stay in business. And we'll talk about a case where that's, but what about a very fast growth scenario? Breaking your product out of the state that you're in into the frozen food aisles, for example, something that might need a huge amount of investment. Today is a, fun space to play around with those ideas. So have that fun, please be creative and have a good time with that breakout. Sure that you're able to sort of imagine something that could happen out there. I'll leave this warning a little bit more to Robert's talk as well. If you have seen it, I'm sure he did some warning about this, but just know that anyone who lends money at any level they are a business too, and they are attempting to make money. Okay. So let's never lose sight of that. Let's understand that people who want to invest in equity or people who work at a bank and want to provide a bank-backed loan, they're all ultimately a business in their own right. And that does lead to some options out there that are less ideal than others. I'm not going to focus on those distinctions, but just keep that in mind over time as you kind of go through these processes. So why bother? What's the point of all this, right? Plenty of businesses can perfectly well exist without ever asking for funding. The first startup I started, we never asked for any outside funding. We put money in to start it, the 3 co-founders, and we ran it and we sold it after a few years, totally fine. But in a way, that means we just kind of got lucky. I mean, that's not true for everyone. And again, we weren't empowered. We felt like financing was for someone else. So if you all want to preview this, drop into chat right now. Why would you ever in your future, or why have you in the past? What kind of events prompted you to ask for some sort of funding, some sort of financing? And this could be friends and family borrowing, that kind of thing, even putting some more of your own money in as owner equity, that type of thing. Yeah, just drop it in chat. Let me know what your ideas there might be. And ultimately, stuff like equipment, stuff like trying to grow are great options. One of the biggest reasons actually that it's empowering to make sure that you understand what kind of money might be available for you and to understanding this process in advance of a crisis is because cash flow problems and running out of cash are the number one reason, combined are the number one reasons that small businesses fail. You could be a profitable business and run out of cash. And if what I just said doesn't make any sense at all, ask me about it later. You are able to be a profitable business at any given moment and one morning just not have cash on hand, not be able to pay the bills, be forced to either get into a really tight lending situation that might not be optimal or simply close the business. That's preventable in many cases, and that's one of the main reasons that what we're talking about today is so important for us all to feel like we're part of. Now, the question of how much should you raise, or how much money do I deserve, or what could I possibly get, those kinds of things, really, unfortunately, there's not one simple answer. You're all very different. You're all your unique, special people out there. And that one question does lead to additional questions. So I want to ask you about think about you when I'm talking here, your need case, the funding source. And again, that's going to really dovetail into what Robert was talking about, or will talk about for some of you, and what that success model looks like. So let's start breaking some of this down a little bit here. The need case, I'm going to talk about it in 2 terms there. We're going to answer the why and the when of what kind of funding can I get. We're going to do that by creating a forecast of some sort and creating another scenario where we've got the funding in place. And we're going to do that using the SMART goals template. I'll talk more about that. And then when you come to the funding source, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Again, Robert, I did or will do a great job of covering all the different types of sources, the details of all those sources. I just want to talk about how they play into when things might be available, who they are, and what kind of funding that might be. And then finally, how do you know if you did good? If you take some money from someone and you put it in the bank and you don't spend it right, how do you know? How do you know? And so you have to plan that as part of these first steps in order to get to the point where you say, great, I've got my 5,000, my 50,000, my $5 million, and things are going in the direction I hoped they would go in, not just I'm getting lucky. All right, so let's start with the why and when part. This is your need case. This is the breakout activity. This is what can I imagine in the future where I might need some kind of funding. The best way to start this is to have a financial forecast of some sort, and then to use that to sort of develop a SMART goals. Now, Has anyone, okay, someone said, I love SMART goals in chat. I can see that, the all caps, thank you. Not everyone, I'm not even a huge fan of acronyms. So I'm just gonna I'll just say this one fits this question so well that I love relying on it. Specific, meaning you know exactly what it is you're asking for. What is it you want to accomplish? Why is that goal important to your business? Not just, I want money. Of course I want money, give me money. That's it, that's not specific. Specific is one of the main things we're going to help define here with the forecast. Measurable, we're going to come back to that kind of at the end, but again, that comes back to that question. If I get this money, how do I know whether I'm going to do well with it? Attainable, I'm going to rely on that source of funding question to ask whether something is attainable or not. Relevant at first seems like a strange question. Relevant to what? Well, how does the idea of, can I get money? What kind of money do I need? How much do I need to ask for? How is that relevant to my business goals? Okay, so that's exactly what we're asking with the word relevant. And then time-based, if you get through a lot of this, the timing piece tends to fall into place. And when I come all the way back to the first thing I said, if you feel empowered to think about this outside of a crisis situation, if you do this before you are already too far down the road and you might fail as a business because you needed that money earlier, time-based actually becomes a bit of a luxury. You can make choices based on it instead of making bad financial decisions because you're under timing pressure. Again, so that's why I want to make sure we're encouraging people. I'm not trying to fear monger here. I'm just trying to encourage you all not to get into crisis situations. So how do we address this? The goals that the way that I'm going to talk about these SMART goals, we're going to talk about how do you create a financial forecast that addresses these. Then how do you address that timing issue that I was just talking about? How do you create a forecast that includes this notion of funding and hopefully the potential growth planning that's associated with that? And frankly, number 4 here is actually a huge component. I'll talk about this when we get into some of these cases. You may not want to pursue a path that includes magnificent, fantastic growth for your business for various reasons. I'll talk about one reason. Some of you all might have those reasons already in your head. And then really this idea of continually updating over time. So let's just dive in. And one quick caveat here. When I talk about financial forecasting, sometimes, especially if you're not a finance expert, this is me. Again, my first business, I had no idea. My accountant did everything. And the difference between accounting and the kind of thing we're talking about today, accounting accounts for where your money is today, and it's correct to looking back to yesterday and the day before that. Any good forecast is your opinion, your guess of where you hoped your money was today, where you hoped it was, and where you think it'll be going into the future. Okay, I'll say it now, but I'll say it again later. Anytime you're forecasting, it's a guess. It's your best guess. It's hopefully a very strategic guess, but that's all it is. And that's why I can speak so quickly about this and say, I think that you can all do this, because I think any of y'all, hopefully, if you're this committed to your business, can imagine a future of some sort for it. And that's where the forecasting comes in, okay? I'll leave these 2 slides in more detail. There's a little bit of nuance between the idea of budgeting and forecasting. I don't need to go into it. Got limited time. I could do this talk in 6 hours. So just, pardon if I'm talking fast. I said earlier, this idea of the useful forecast. And so, what do we mean here? Again, if I'm really committed to this idea that a forecast is just a guess about the future, I'll even take that a step further. The forecast is always incorrect. It's always wrong, right? If anyone here can forecast perfectly into the future, that may be the best business for you to be in. But the majority of us are just doing better and better over time. So a useful forecast is something that you actually understand. Again, I talk about my first startup as a cautionary tale all the time. Our accountant made a budget at the beginning of the year, even in our fastest growth phases in the world. He never could understand how much business we could take in, how much we could grow. He made a budget that said, oh, well, we need to hire this many contractors to do this much work. And we blew those goals out of the water by the second month, and we never updated that budget. So it was useless. I don't know if anyone's ever encountered that. How many people have, in the last 3 years have said, wow, that budget, it's laughably incorrect, right? And it's partially because you don't update it, but it's also because that sometimes the business owner doesn't truly own that forecast, that strategic look into the future. So it's important here from the perspective of what we're talking about to make sure that you as the owner, you as the strategic visionary, or the person who knows how to talk about the forecast, even if all the accounting work is still something that maybe not done by you, maybe done by an outside accountant, your CFO, et cetera. And in that sense, don't duplicate the accounting work. Okay. In the same way that no bank ever wants to read a business plan that's 100 pages long because you are able to talk for that long about your topic, they also don't want to see a financial forecast that is 100 pages long where you've listed every possible, let's say I'm a bike store. I don't want to list every model of bicycle I might ever sell. I want to forecast based on big categories. So I can answer questions like, do I intend to sell more mountain bikes next year than road bikes? What is the profit margin on accessories versus, food supplements, that kind of thing. Big categories, maybe 5, 6 categories of revenues and expenses. And I'll talk about that in detail in a bit. But that's also going to help you kind of have that ownership, that vision into this forecast. So remember that forecast shouldn't duplicate the accounting. You don't want to take all those ledger items and just duplicate them. I'm glad that we're talking about stuff like business model and business strategy and pitching those things. The forecast itself, this idea of creating a view into your future, becomes part of your story. And it should not only build from the business model in the way that you describe it. So in this case, if I'm here in Oregon and I say my local premier gym and social hub where families can do a workout and all this kind of stuff, okay, great. Well, then my big revenue streams had better be gym related stuff, maybe some personal training, that kind of thing, maybe something having to do with this family. So it should connect to the business model, and it should also inform and reflect the overall strategy. Okay. When we think about a forecast, it should not be, again, I hate to say this one more time, but it should not be something that your accountant handed to you and you're following the rules as best you can. If your strategy is to grow faster than your forecast is currently predicting, or possibly to weather the storm in a way that may be more risky than your forecast is predicting, it's a good time to come back and update that financial forecast, especially if you're ever going to show it to someone else. Express the intelligence you have about your business. And then finally, you really should have all of these financial statements in that forecast. A lot of times I'll see a very quick, oh my gosh, the motion detector, a very quick sort of forecast created from, sorry, I'm in an odd room here, a quick Excel sheet and that kind of thing. Better than nothing in all cases. But really try to make this into something where you can generate the entire vision for this business. So profitability, especially stuff like direct costs, that kind of thing. And then ultimately, of course, and I've talked to so many folks like you on today's call where they create a forecast, they feel great about it, and maybe somebody influenced them or pushed them in some direction that they didn't like, and they say, yeah, but that's not really how I'm going to manage the business. That's just this thing that I'm going to show to this investor, or that's this thing I made for the pitch, for the big pitch competition because I wanted to look good, but I'm going to go back to this other way of managing my business. This isn't useful. Make it realistic, make it feel realistic, and make it, again, part of your business model, not someone else's. But most of all, it exists. Please, if you're not the kind of person who does this kind of work, I understand, I get it. Most of us, drop in a chat if you went into business for financial forecasting. I don't think we're going to get a lot of replies to that. A lot of us go into business for things that we love doing, and a lot of times that doesn't top the list. So try to make time to do this work if you can, when you can, and come up with some way of looking to the future. So what do? The good news is you can sometimes do this pretty quickly. A lot of us are able to generate something quick and easy if you follow some of these rules, which are, really focus on the revenue streams, maybe even just start with words, like a verbal description of that financial forecast. I want to make money by selling the following things and this one service that I offer. And I think my major expenses are blank, blank, and blank. If you have that instead of nothing, and you go and meet with, let's say, your local SBDC consultants, in addition to these fine folks at RAIN, you have something to start from, and you can start putting in the numbers and that kind of thing. And that's what's going to get you down through that second item so that you can get to the reality check portion, so that you can get into the point where you say, okay, well, how much funding could I have and what would be my growth model from there? And again, or not, maybe that's not what you want. And that's, again, a personal kind of thing. So that's the real steps that you need to take to get through this process. When I say revenue, again, my advice when talking about revenue in a forecast setting is to limit the revenue streams. Keep them in these major categorical status, right? Don't drill down into everything. And I would actually say, try to limit yourself to like 5 to 7 revenue streams if you can. That's my personal advice. Some folks will end up having more. Some businesses have 1 or 2 revenue streams, something very, very specific, and that's all you produce. But if you're a coffee shop and you make 100 different kinds of drinks, maybe you need to come up with categories. If you're a food service, anything in the food service industry, by the way, your menu is already categorized. It's a perfect example. Drinks, entrees, appetizers are a great way to start thinking about categorizing your revenues in very concise ways and using words that you already use. Okay, so again, that's what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to list every single item. We're not trying to showcase the fact that I have 100 things that I can sell. I'm trying to showcase my ability to be concise, to summarize, so that number one, I'm able to get through this process quickly. The more items you put into your revenues and expenses, the more time you're going to spend going through this process over and over again. And number two, when I make changes or when I add funding or when I come back to this and improve it over time, I don't want to feel overwhelmed by a list that's way too long. So keep it into those smaller numbers. Definitely look forward 3-5 years. That's kind of the range I like to stick to myself. I sometimes see forecasts that'll get us through, a typical business budget. Very often it'll be set on January 1 and then be out of date by February and not updated till the next January. But it's only that 1 year anyway, so it doesn't necessarily show a long-term strategy. So use this for that strategic view. Yeah, and feel free. And I'm just kind of looking over here at the questions real quick. Melody, system years created for. So Melody, these are the screenshots we're looking at are from the app live plan, and I think some of y'all get access to this, and some of y'all won't, and we can figure all that out. But again, this can be done quickly in a spreadsheet. We just happen to make this app here in Oregon, and that's going to be my preference on a personal level for sure. But obviously, also if you work with your SBDC office. They sometimes will have, sort of SBA-backed lender templates and that kind of thing. So all sorts of great options out there. When it comes to expenses, very similar to revenue, very similar advice overall. Expenses are actually.
Peter?
Oh, yep, please.
I just wanted you to give you a heads up that in about 10 minutes, we'll get started with the breakouts.
Okay, great. So yes, so expenses, same advice. So I'm just gonna blast through some of these topics here then. What kinds of expenses? This is again a place to show your expertise. What are the costs of goods sold, customer acquisition costs, lifetime value, these kinds of things. Whatever applies to your business and whatever feels most urgent, make sure to express that in those expenses. If you're a newer business, a great way, if you're doing this for the first time ever, a great way to think about all the common business costs that you might encounter is to look at a longer list of lots of expenses that businesses run into and just delete the ones that don't apply to you. So then, as you're determining the amount of financing, this is going to depend on the types of expenses that you have are going to depend on the financing and be kind of interrelated. So if your growth goal is based on customer growth, your expenses will probably reflect that customer acquisition cost. If your growth goal is about getting through a tough period, well, you might want to talk about expenses from a worst case scenario, right? And if you want to make sure that you're able to fund a big product launch that's in the future, some big thing, well, what are all the incremental costs that go up to that and when do they arise? So again, expenses are a great place to express your expertise. And if you have questions as you go through this process, great time to talk to mentors, great time to talk to anyone who will talk to you about that kind of thing, even people in your industry in some cases. So ultimately then the goal is to get to this point where we have a growth plan, a forecast where the grass is whatever color it currently is, and then another forecast where the grass is slightly different color, hopefully greener. And that's where we get to this point where we've got the SMART goals. So once we have this forecast in place, once we have this baseline, this useful, you could use it for management, you might want to start saying, okay, well, how could timing affect the ask for money? Where does that T in SMART goals come from? And again, come back to your own expertise. If your growth goal is based on customer growth, Do you want to try to start that process right now? Oh, no, it's out of season. No, we wouldn't start that till December. That's when our big, like those kinds of answers are what we tend to hear to these kinds of questions. So, infer that in that forecast that you're going to make. Do you need to hire people over time? How long does it take to make those hires? If you need to get through a difficult time, definitely just be conservative, with timing. Don't wait till the last minute there. Don't be the business that runs out of cash, especially if it's preventable, please. And then again, demonstrate that expertise. So that's what I would make sure. So with SMART goals, as far as the forecast goes, we've gotten through most of these except the attainable one. And a lot of times, attainable is actually going to come back to the funding sources. So again, I'm not going to review this in great depth, but sometimes whether a piece of like an item, an engagement of funding is attainable by you is based on a few factors, right? The source, the capacity, the requirements, that kind of thing. So like Robert's going to or has asked, what kind of funding source is you? And then we can also talk about what kind of levels are available from each source. So your venture, just like to boil it all the way down. And again, to summarize what Robert's coming from in his talk, the financing you might get for your venture is really going to only come from 3 types of sources, right? Someone who will want the money back with interest. So that's like your bank loan, your invoice factoring, that kind of thing. People who will give you money in exchange for partial ownership of your venture is a different category. That's the whole equity group. And then the third category is just you selling things at a profit and putting that profit in your bank and growing the business based on that. And that's really all there is. So that leads us to know that there are certain ranges. And I saw someone asked about the slides. Ani, we give them the slides, of course, right? Because I know I'm clicking through a bunch of text here. I made these slides so you can refer to them afterwards. So I hope so. I'll email too if you can. A lot of these categories
they all have the slides. I send them on Tuesday evening, and I also shared the link here on the chat.
Great, love it. Okay, so these ranges can help you define what kinds of financing might be appropriate for you and that kind of thing. And the ultimate, if you have a personal goal of not asking for money, that kind of thing, and you could still go through this exercise and have this emergency notion of what kind of funding you might have, there is still, pros and cons to making a sales-based growth business, right? The growth is less risky. You might prefer to kind of be alone, make your own big decisions, that kind of thing, and grow in this stealth mode, but there may be cons to that approach as well. I'm not going to talk too much about equity financing. If there are folks in the group here who really are pursuing this, it's probably a different path than the majority of the group. But as far as equity goes, you got to have that hockey stick type growth. You got to have that potential future after that hockey stick. And with those things in place, you can start to have slightly irrational approaches to your early stage financing that might not be suitable for an otherwise profitable business. You can have times when you're actually you're not making a profit for a long period of time because the equity investors want you to spend that money as fast as you can so you can get to that fast growth phase. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is where 99% of small businesses land, which is I might do stuff like invoice factoring. I might do something like a bank-backed loan for a larger amount, an SBA-backed loan for something like real estate. So that's the other end of the spectrum because the amounts can range, from $5,000 to a couple $1 million, but they're far more reliable, far more predictable. They're FDIC-backed, all this kind of thing. But their process is still going to take a little bit of time, and there are some restrictions to that process. Primarily, a startup is generally not going to get an SBA-backed large-size loan, whereas a early-stage startup or a pre-revenue startup is really only suitable for equity-type investing in those early stages, or friends and family money, that kind of thing. So again, all of this comes back to that idea of the attainable point in the SMART goal, and I want to make sure we understand that with that, we've got this whole package. Now, real quick, the final piece here is that success model. So we made that forecast. How do you know if you're using that money wisely? How do you maintain that focus over time? And I want to introduce this idea of lean to this topic here. A lot of people don't think about lean planning, lean forecasting in these topics of financials, but the general startup notion or the general, lean manufacturing notion of build, measure, learn can absolutely apply to this process that we just talked about. If you remember me saying earlier, anytime you're guessing about the future, you should treat it like a guess. It can be very intelligent and take a lot of time and expertise to get there, but know that the value of that guess is going to come from learning why your guess is different from what really happened. Interrogate that difference between accounting and forecasting, and make sure you go through this cycle over and over again, possibly every month, if you can make time for it. By doing that, you're going to start understanding why those differences emerged, whether there are trends in the market that you might be wanting to address in future forecasts, and making sure that you're frankly keeping up with your own business, that you're not letting things go in a direction that you don't want them to go, like a lot of budgets might allow your business to do. If in 2 years ago in February, 3 years ago in February, I predicted what this dog might look like, I might have a ridiculously outmoded forecast by the end of that time. So really comparing forecast to actuals is the ultimate way to make sure that you're reaching that success model, and that any kind of financing you might get can then be tracked accordingly. So again, that's the SMART goals piece. Ani, I'm going to try and do each of these cases 1 minute each, okay? The text is available on these slides. I want to kick you into gear here, thinking about how, because your breakout sessions, I'm going to ask you to imagine a world where you do want to ask for financing, whether you do or you don't. I want a new scenario from you, some new idea. How would you create the forecast to go after that? So let's just talk about 3 businesses that I've worked with, whatever, fairly recently, and I've anonymized them here. So one case where you might want to pursue financing. Here's a therapy center that does various types of like massage therapy and other types of sports therapy. They're in a location and they could possibly buy or rent, actually, they had the buy or rent choice, the building right next door, $2 million option. And they think that they could probably basically double their business and double their revenue and pay off the amount needed for that loan and actually make it work. So step 1 for that SMART approach that we talked about, make that forecast, right? We know our profitability, you can see it right there. We know our net profit over time, and then make that new forecast with that expansion growth potential. Now I'm going to point out one interesting thing here, but if I go back to the SMART goals, right? We've got the need for the funding. It's quite clear. We've got the fact that it's measurable. Yes, of course. It's attainable. Well, is it? It might be. That'll depend on the business owner, how long they've been in business, all that kind of thing. But in this case, it was attainable in this particular instance. It could be relevant, and let's ask that question, because time-based is fine. But one of the things that came out of this particular exercise with this particular business, if we look here, even though they doubled their revenue overall, the overall profitability of the business essentially remained the same. The business owner factored in a $10,000 raise for themselves, and that pretty much soaked up all of the profitability. So now this business owner has twice as many people to manage, a massive loan that they felt like was pretty intimidating, and no real benefit to them. That's kind of how they perceived it. So should she pursue this financing just to double the size of the business for what she perceived as no benefit to herself? I'll leave that up to you. But you can see how this can get a little like ambiguous, right? Let's talk about a case where it's a little less ambiguous. I know nothing about crabbing. I just know that they had some kind of algae problem. So this business predicted a couple of years ago that the algae problem could possibly force them to run out of cash. Okay, so real quick, their forecast as is had this really low part here in the cash on hand, right? You can see this low point here in the middle, where we're in July there. And if the algae problem got to a certain point that they thought it might, they would indeed fail as a business right here. They would be in the red for a few months at a time, right? So how did they do? Well, they went through these SMART goals. They said, okay, great, well, we can do this. In fact, because of those dips throughout those years, we think we can be profitable afterwards just fine because other things come into season. So all we need to do is borrow maybe 10 or 12K, 12 on the conservative side, and live to crab another day. Now, this worked just fine for them. But again, this is a potential failure case for a perfectly profitable business, right? Borrowing this money and being able to pay it back quickly is the difference between running out of cash or not for this business. And even though they could have forecasted that based on instinct, them writing it down made a huge difference for them. And then case 3, real quick, fast growth business. What if I got that equity investment that I think, is going to be the minority of people in this room here? They're going to do this baseline forecast. If y'all ever want to look at some, popular business decks, slide decks where they pitch these equity investors, a lot of them show a profit model. So some of the big ones, Mint, LinkedIn, all these kind of business owners came into this as if these businesses could be profitable, but really wanted to pursue as much equity financing as they could get so they could build their user base as much as possible. But you still approach it very similarly. You build that forecast, you show what you could possibly do, and then you build that forecast again with that potential for growth funding, with that, in this case, the equity financing is where the growth funding is coming from. And you can see that, the net profit in this case goes up by like a huge amount, 10x in this case, difference between $500,000 to a $5.5 million business. In their case, do they want to pursue it? Yes, of course. It meets all of their SMART goals. It's the reason this company went into business. And so pursuing that is the core function of the business owner, right? It becomes what they do. So again, I want you all to think creatively. And my challenge, I think, Ani, if I can say it again, is just, if you've considered anything I've talked about today so far, use the breakout time to try to think about some other way in which a financing event might change the nature of or help a type of growth of your business. If you can't think of anything at all, what about a new location? What about international distribution? What about just, weathering the worst storm you can imagine? It sounds negative, but I want you to stay in business, so hopefully it's not. What else do we need to consider, Ani, here?
I think you need to consider thinking outside of the box. Don't think about it right now for this activity. Don't think about it as your business mind and what you need to do in your day-to-day. Think about it creatively, like when you were a kid and you would imagine things that were amazing. Imagine that for your business and evaluate that case scenario. The idea for today is to really just get in a completely different mindset. And then we're going to come back and we're going to go over the questions that we have on the chat and regroup. Okay, so I am going to begin the breakouts right now. I'm going to open all of the rooms and you guys are slowly going to go to them. I'm gonna throw you in one of them, Peter.
Great.
Yeah. And if any of you guys, part of the team, are here, you can assign yourself to one. For some reason, this thing is a little funky. Come on now. There we go. All right, I'm assigning you guys.
You're doing great. This is very quick.
You're also, I think that you are able to assign yourself to. You could go into the room that has the least amount of people. And I am going to stop the recording in. Thank you for doing the recording. Very much appreciated. I bet you guys didn't have enough time, but I hope that what you get from this is allow yourself to look at a bigger picture that has no limitations, and then bring it back and see what little steps you can take to eventually get there. I think that's really good because sometimes we, as business owners, just focus so much on the day-to-day that we don't give ourselves some time to just think without limitations. And I think it's important to do that every now and then. I think that's how a lot of very innovative things have happened. And some of them change the world, some of them change you, some of them change your community, and all of those are good impacts. So I hope this was an interesting exercise for you guys. So what do we have here? Do we have everybody? We do. All right. Hello. I'm going to bring Peter back in the spotlight. And we're going to ask some questions. All right. So we don't have a lot of questions. So the good thing about this is that we can go back to some parts of your presentation that you feel like it would be good to share or to clarify. And if you guys have any more questions, you're welcome to write them on the chat. We will ask them. So this one question is what you need always about what your business needs to run, or is it also about what you need to leave?
Leave, like leave behind? I think you got muted there.
No, to live, like your life.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is what we experienced in our breakout session. It becomes, I trapped you all into this. It becomes a very personal question very quickly, right? You think that this sort of impersonal thing where we're talking about numbers and financial forecasting and all this nonsense, but almost one step down the road, it instantly becomes, well, what do I want? Like and again, back to that first case I said, where this woman had this perfectly great business. And she had kind of, one of the things she said, she was like, I've hired all of the experts that I know. I've hired all my friends and I love working with them. I can't name twice as many employees that I would want to hire right off the bat. So, she had what she needed to live in that sense. And she was happy. So the idea of expanding her business by 2x just seemed like something you're supposed to do, but wasn't strategic from a personal perspective. Does that make sense? So I don't know if that exactly answers the question, but it ultimately is part of this discussion, regardless, unless everyone here does like a massive IPO and you are beholden to your shareholders. Right now, you're in the phase where you can actually make those kinds of decisions. So that's something to think about there.
Yes, it's you want to be able to also live the life that you want to live, and if you find yourself in a situation where you know that is not possible, it's okay to walk away. If you're walking into a situation where you can make it happen, it's okay to really grind it and do it. So it's good to ask these questions because it really puts things into perspective.
If I can if I can do a personal anecdote real quick, I won't take very long.
Yes.
The very first business, the reason we sold it is because we had a board meeting and the 3 co-founders, we just realized we hated the industry we were in. I guess I won't name it now that I said that, but it was what we knew how to do from previous work that we had all done together. We entered it because we could make a lot of money. It worked. We lived in New York City. Everything was great. We were young people, that first company. And one day we just were like, we hate everything about this. We hate it. And that's why we sold everything that we had at that moment. There was no other good reason. There was no logic behind it, just that. So as personal as it can get. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and Ani, one more thing. Anyone who's creating a forecast for the first time, we talked about paying yourself. Never create a financial forecast for a business that you might pursue without including you paying yourself. It's unbelievably common. You think, oh, I'll get to it when I can, or maybe once I make enough money. And then you get these folks who run a business and aren't paying themselves, and it never could have been profitable if they had, and they're stuck. And that's a really tricky situation. You can avoid that by this process that we're talking about as well. Yeah, we've got a brick and mortar.
That is really good advice. Thank you for sharing that. Another question was when you were explaining that that one case with the person that was thinking about expanding into the place next door. Somebody asked, what about investing in real estate, like investing in that building because it's real estate?
Yeah, and again, it's a funny question because that was another part of that exact same thing. So she was renting the space that she was in, and the outcome of this would be, oh, now she's sort of in the real estate business, which was a huge turnoff for her. She hated the idea. Again, it was just one of those things where it was like, again, very personal. So, like if you find yourself in a situation, there's a brick and mortar question here also. So like if you find yourself in a situation of one of these like buy versus rent conversations, for some people, like buying a space, owning the space that you're in is just the ultimate success. It's the ultimate luxury, right? This could go for your own personal home, but we're talking about your business here as well. And for some, it's utterly disgusting. It's the worst thing that, like, why would I ever want to be stuck married to a place, can't leave it ever, it's mine, and I hate, like, what if it burns? Like, all these kinds of questions plague them. They won't sleep at night if they owned it. That's a huge personality thing. And I think, I never want to advise one versus the other conceptually. But yeah, you do want to figure out kind of where you fall on that spectrum before you go down too far, either one of those roads.
Awesome. Peter, do you have any books or podcasts that you recommend for continued education on forecasting, business growth, business analytics, and things like that?
Oh man, good questions. I'm gonna have to think about those. I'm trying not to think of anything too corny out there. So yeah, let me follow up with some.
I'll allow you to follow up over email with that.
Yeah, no, perfect. Yeah.
Is there anything you would recommend a small first-time brick and mortar owner? Oh, it's also about reading or doing if they are just starting out.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like the brick and mortar question, definitely, it kind of occupies its own sphere, right? It's got its own special thing. I'll think about if I've got any like specific recommendations there. But again, one of the biggest things I would think of, and if you haven't read like either the Lean Startup or any of the other Eric Ries, I forget what the other one's now called, the one about lean management. Do think about that. And this is kind of a recommendation for everyone. That lean cycle I mentioned when it comes to financial forecasting is something that's beneficial for any type of overall business management. And what I mean there is, how do you, like, if you're going to go into a brick and mortar store, are you sure that your customers want what you are selling, right? Nothing's more heartbreaking than something that could have sold great online, but doesn't really belong in a brick and mortar environment. And the only way that you test that is by going through all the trouble of opening an entire store, when instead you could have come up with some way of testing the hypothesis, figuring out whether customers will make those purchases, right? There was a food cart in our breakout room. What a great example of a way to test whether a restaurant is viable, then, as small as you can get, right? What's the smallest unit of serving this for real customers and seeing if customers will keep coming back, than doing that. So any of those kind of, and again, Lean Startup's the most popular, but I can't remember the other one now, which is more about business management instead of the startup culture. But anything that encourages those sort of like cyclic, iterative processes and running tests. And I'll send a few of those titles your way. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. There are a lot of good recommendations on the chat, by the way, and I will extract that and share that with you. But I'm not going to promise that I'm going to send that tomorrow. It'll probably be after the twister that we're in on this really fast-paced program kind of winds down, and I think there's really good information here. So let's see. I do want to. Peter, I don't know if you don't know, but I did a lot of tests. I did open a brick and mortar store, and I also closed it. And I do have to tell you, regardless of the amount of testing, research, tryouts that you do, nothing prepares you for your brick and mortar journey as being there and doing it. Like sometimes you just need that assurance that you're not going to have that question lingering in your head all your life and be like, oh, if I would have ever, sometimes you just got to go for it and you will grow in the process. And it's going to be something that you never imagined. It's going to bring really great joy. It's going to be a lot of challenges, but the end result is going to be that you grow and you learn and you had the experience and never having that question in your mind.
Yeah. So absolutely. And I think, listen, let's apply that back to the topic we talked about today. I have no idea why I'm so blurry right now, by the way. I think my camera got tired after all this time. But, so I'll follow up with some sort of ideas and tools about how to get started on the process that I just talked about. For now, write down some words. I see that some of you already have, just draft down something. And a lot of times that'll lead to other questions. And those questions will be the thing that you can explore next and will take you further down that road that we just talked about. So just, like I said, actually do that and take the time to actually do that. And I think it'll just take you a little bit further along in that journey. So that's great. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for a great session today. I know this was a lot of information. Tomorrow, I will send you guys, again, I will send you the link to the slides. I will send you the link to the breakout activities. Take a look at them in your own time. I'm also going to send the takeaways form for this week. And essentially the main questions that you're going to answer is one, what funding source is right for you and how much you should raise. So I think it's a very simple but straight to the point and effective way of you guys to think about what you learned here today. And we will see you next Wednesday evening. Oh, actually, to some of the ones of you that are going to attend the makeup session for our debacle of yesterday, we'll see you on Monday. And to the rest of you, I will see you on Wednesday. Let's keep in touch over email. Don't worry, Peter. Oh, you're back. And thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. Any parting words that you would like to share?
No, thank you guys. It's been fun talking to you. I enjoyed my breakout room. I'm sure the others were awesome as well, but have fun with this, ask questions, lead to more questions, and then there'll be some more after that. And like I said, I'll follow up with some tips and some other ideas on what we can do to help actually do this process. And instead of saying, oh, I'm not a numbers person and just not doing anything. That's what we're going to try to avoid. So I'm going to be here to support for the rest of this time as well. So thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, bye everybody. Have a good evening. I'm going to stay here for about 5 minutes if anybody has any questions, and I'm going to stop the recording.